The forest near my childhood home had always been a place of mystery and fear. For as long as I can remember, my parents forbade me from entering it, even during the day. It was as if an invisible barrier separated our home from the thick, dark woods that loomed just beyond the backyard. The trees stood tall and menacing, their branches intertwining to form a canopy that blocked out the sun, casting the forest floor in perpetual shadow. The air was different there too, thicker, colder, and filled with an eerie silence that seemed unnatural. I was never told exactly why the forest was off limits, but the warning was always clear: stay out of the woods. Of course, as a child, my curiosity was piqued by this forbidden place. My friends and I would often dare each other to venture to the edge of the trees, but none of us ever had the courage to go further. We all had heard the stories, the whispered tales passed down through generations in our small town. Stories of people who had entered the woods and never returned, of strange lights seen flickering among the trees at night, and of a presence that watched from the shadows. The older I got, the more I dismissed these tales as just that, stories. But there was always a part of me that remained uneasy, a lingering sense of dread whenever I found myself too close to the tree line. Then, when I was 15, something happened that changed everything. It was a hot summer evening and my parents were hosting a barbecue for some family friends. The adults were gathered on the back deck, laughing and talking, while the younger kids played in the yard. I was sitting on the swing set, half listening to the conversation while staring at the forest, my mind wandering. That's when I saw it. A flash of movement among the trees, so quick and subtle that I almost thought I had imagined it. But then I saw it again, something tall and pale, slipping between the trees like a shadow. My heart skipped a beat, and I stood up, squinting to get a better look. But whatever it was, it had vanished. I told myself it was just my imagination, a trick of the light, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, something watching. That night, after everyone had left and my parents had gone to bed, I found myself unable to sleep. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing with thoughts of the forest and the figure I had seen. The window next to my bed was open, letting in the cool night air, and I could hear the distant sound of crickets chirping. But there was something else too, a faint rustling sound, like footsteps in the grass. I sat up, my heart pounding, and listened. The sound grew louder, closer, until it was right outside my window. I held my breath, too terrified to move as I heard the unmistakable sound of something or someone breathing. Slowly, I turned my head toward the window, and that's when I saw it. A face, pale and ghostly, peering in at me from the darkness. Its eyes were large and black, reflecting the dim light of my room, and its mouth was stretched into a twisted grin. It was only there for a moment, but that moment felt like an eternity. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it was gone. I scrambled out of bed, slamming the window shut and pulling the curtains closed, my hands shaking. I wanted to scream, to wake my parents, but I was paralyzed by fear, my mind struggling to comprehend what I had just seen. That night I barely slept, every creak and groan of the house sending my heart racing. By morning I had convinced myself that it had all been a nightmare, a figment of my overactive imagination. But deep down I knew that wasn't true. Something was in the woods, and it was watching me. The days that followed were a blur of unease and paranoia. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that the thing I had seen outside my window was still out there, lurking just beyond the edge of the forest. Every time I stepped outside, I found myself scanning the tree line, searching for any sign of movement, any hint that it was there. But there was nothing. I tried to go about my daily routine, to push the memory of that night to the back of my mind, but it was always there, lurking in the corners of my thoughts. I became jumpy, startling at the slightest noise, and my parents began to notice. "Are you feeling all right, sweetheart?" my mom asked one morning as I picked at my breakfast, unable to stomach the food. "Yeah, I'm fine," I lied, forcing a smile. "Just didn't sleep well." She frowned, concern etched on her face, but she didn't press the issue. I knew they wouldn't believe me if I told them what I had seen. They would brush it off as a bad dream or an overactive imagination, just like I had tried to do. But I couldn't ignore the growing sense of dread that seemed to cling to me like a shadow. A week passed, and I began to think that maybe I was overreacting. Maybe it really had been a trick of the light, or some kind of animal that had wandered too close to the house. I tried to convince myself that it was nothing, that I was safe. But then, one night it happened again. I was lying in bed, the house silent around me, when I heard it. The soft rustling of footsteps outside my window. My heart leaped into my throat and I froze, straining to hear. The footsteps grew closer, and then I heard the breathing, a slow, labored sound, like someone struggling to draw air into their lungs. I squeezed my eyes shut, praying that it would go away, that I was just imagining things. But the sound persisted, growing louder, closer, until it was right outside my window. And then, just like before, I felt its presence. I didn't dare open my eyes, too terrified of what I might see, but I could feel it, that same cold, malevolent energy seeping through the walls, pressing down on me, suffocating me. It was as if the very air around me had turned to ice, freezing me in place. I don't know how long I lay there, paralyzed with fear, but eventually the presence began to fade. The footsteps retreated, the breathing grew fainter, and the air in the room slowly warmed. But I didn't move, didn't open my eyes until I was certain it was gone. When I finally did, I found myself drenched in sweat, my heart still racing. I glanced at the window, half expecting to see that pale face staring back at me, but it was closed, the curtains drawn tight. I spent the rest of the night huddled under the covers, my mind racing with fear and confusion. What was it? Why was it here? And most importantly, what did it want? But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't come up with any answers. All I knew was that it was out there and it was watching me. As the days turned into weeks, my fear began to morph into a kind of obsession. I became fixated on the idea of finding out what was in the woods, of uncovering the truth behind the presence that haunted me. It was as if I was being drawn to it, compelled to seek it out, even though every instinct in my body screamed at me to stay away. I started spending more and more time near the edge of the forest, my eyes scanning the trees for any sign of movement. I would sit on the swing set for hours, just staring into the darkness, waiting for it to appear. But no matter how long I watched, it never showed itself. At night, I would lie awake, listening for the sound of footsteps, the rasping breath, but the presence never returned to my window. It was almost as if it was toying with me, keeping its distance but never fully leaving. I couldn't talk to anyone about what was happening, not my parents, not my friends. I was afraid they would think I was crazy, that they would dismiss my fears as nothing more than the imaginings of an overactive mind. So I kept it all to myself, the fear, the obsession, the growing sense of unease that gnawed at me day and night. But the more I kept it inside, the more it consumed me. One afternoon, after another restless night, I made a decision. I couldn't keep living in fear, couldn't keep letting this thing control my life. I had to face it, had to find out what it was, once and for all. I waited until my parents were busy with their own tasks, and then slipped out of the house, heading for the edge of the woods. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the yard, and the air was thick with the scent of pine and earth. I hesitated at the tree line, my heart pounding in my chest. Every instinct told me to turn back, to run home and lock the door behind me. But I couldn't. I had to know. Taking a deep breath, I stepped into the forest. The change was immediate. The temperature dropped several degrees and the sunlight barely penetrated the thick canopy above. The ground was soft beneath my feet, covered in a thick layer of moss and fallen leaves. The air was heavy with the scent of decay, and the silence was deafening. Every sound I made seemed magnified. The crunch of leaves underfoot, the snap of a twig as I moved deeper into the woods. My breath came in short, shallow gasps, and I could feel the pulse of my heart in my throat. But I kept moving forward, driven by a mix of fear and determination. I didn't have a plan, didn't know what I would do if or when I found it. All I knew was that I had to keep going. The deeper I went, the more disorienting the forest became. The trees all looked the same, tall and ancient, their trunks twisted and gnarled as if they had grown out of the nightmares of some forgotten era. The underbrush grew thicker, thorny vines wrapping around my ankles, trying to pull me back. But I pushed on, my eyes scanning the shadows for any sign of movement. And then I found it. At first, it was just a feeling, a shift in the air that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. I stopped, my breath catching in my throat, and slowly turned in a circle, trying to pinpoint the source of my unease. And that's when I saw it, a figure standing motionless among the trees. It was tall, unnaturally so, its limbs long and thin like the branches of the trees that surrounded it. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, and it seemed to shimmer in the dim light that filtered through the canopy. But it was the eyes that held me captive, large, black, and devoid of any emotion. They stared at me with an intensity that made my blood run cold, as if it could see straight through me into the darkest corners of my soul. For a moment I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. I was rooted to the spot, my mind screaming at me to run but my body refusing to obey. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound. It just watched me, its head cocked slightly to one side, as if it was curious or perhaps amused by my fear. Finally, I forced myself to take a step back, and then another. But as I did, the figure began to move slowly, deliberately, matching my steps with its own. It didn't walk so much as glide, its feet barely touching the ground. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from it. Every instinct screamed at me to turn and run, but I knew that if I did it would chase me, and I didn't think I could outrun it. I kept backing away, my eyes locked on the figure as it continued to follow me, its movements eerily fluid, almost inhuman. The trees seemed to close in around me, their branches reaching out like skeletal hands, clawing at my clothes, my skin. But I didn't stop, didn't dare look away, until I was nearly at the edge of the forest. And then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure stopped. It stood there, just beyond the tree line, watching me with those empty black eyes. I took another step back, and then another, until I was out of the woods, standing in the open air of my backyard. But it didn't follow. I watched it for a long moment, half expecting it to step out of the shadows and come after me, but it just stood there, a silent sentinel in the darkness of the forest, watching, waiting. Finally, I turned and ran, not stopping until I was back in the safety of my house, the door locked behind me. My parents were in the living room, oblivious to the terror that had unfolded just beyond our backyard. I didn't tell them what had happened, didn't mention the figure I had seen in the woods, but that night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was still out there, watching me, and deep down I knew that this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. I avoided the forest after that, going out of my way to stay clear of the tree line, even in broad daylight. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't escape the feeling that it was always there, lurking just out of sight. The sense of being watched never left me, a constant gnawing presence at the back of my mind. I started having nightmares, vivid, terrifying dreams where I was back in the forest, the figure with the black eyes stalking me through the trees. In the dreams, I could never escape it, no matter how fast I ran, no matter how hard I tried to hide. It would always find me, its cold, bony hands reaching out to drag me back into the darkness. I would wake up in a cold sweat, my heart racing, and for a few moments I would be convinced that it was in the room with me, standing at the foot of my bed, waiting for me to fall back asleep. It got to the point where I was afraid to go to sleep, afraid of what I might see, what might be waiting for me in the darkness. My parents noticed the change in me, of course. I was pale, jumpy, exhausted all the time. They asked me if something was wrong, if I was having trouble at school, if I was sick, but I couldn't tell them the truth. How could I explain that I was being haunted by something in the woods, something that shouldn't exist? Instead, I lied. I told them I was just stressed out about school, that I wasn't sleeping well, that I was fine, but I could see the worry in their eyes, the way they exchanged glances when they thought I wasn't looking. I started spending more time away from home, finding excuses to stay out late with friends, or to go to the library after school. But no matter where I went, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was following me, that it was always just a few steps behind, waiting for the right moment to strike. And then, one night, it did. It was a Friday, and I had gone out to the movies with a few friends. We had seen some forgettable horror flick, and I had spent the whole time too on edge to enjoy it. By the time we left the theatre, it was already dark, the sky overcast and threatening rain. My friends offered to give me a ride home, but I declined, needing some time to clear my head. I figured the walk would do me good, help me shake off the lingering anxiety that had been plaguing me all day. Besides, it was only a short walk back to my house, just a few blocks. But as I walked, the familiar sense of unease began to creep in. The streets were deserted, the only sound the distant rumble of thunder. The streetlights flickered, casting long, distorted shadows on the pavement. I picked up my pace, my eyes darting nervously from side to side, searching for any sign of movement. And then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it. A figure, standing at the edge of a nearby alley, partially hidden in the shadows. It was tall, impossibly so, its limbs long and thin, its skin pale and ghostly in the dim light. Its eyes were black voids, staring at me with an intensity that made my blood run cold. I froze, my heart skipping a beat. For a moment we just stared at each other, the world around us falling away, and then, slowly, it began to move toward me. I didn't think. I just ran. I sprinted down the street, my footsteps echoing off the pavement, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I could hear it behind me, the soft rustle of its movements, the labored sound of its breathing. It was gaining on me, getting closer with every step. I rounded the corner onto my street, my house in sight, but I knew I wouldn't make it. It was too fast, too relentless. I could feel it right behind me, its icy breath on the back of my neck. And then, just as I reached my front yard, I tripped. I went down hard, my knees and palms scraping against the rough pavement. Pain shot through my legs, but I didn't have time to think about it. I scrambled to my feet, my eyes darting around, searching for any sign of the figure. But it was gone. I stood there panting, my heart pounding in my chest, waiting for it to reappear, to finish what it had started. But the street was empty, the only sound the distant rumble of thunder. Slowly I backed up toward my house, my eyes never leaving the spot where I had last seen it. I fumbled for my keys, my hands shaking, and unlocked the door, practically falling inside. I slammed the door shut, locking it behind me, and leaned against it, trying to catch my breath. My parents were already in bed, the house silent and dark. I was alone, but I knew, deep down, that it wasn't over. Not yet. The days that followed were a blur of fear and paranoia. I barely left the house, too afraid of what might be waiting for me out there. The figure had made its intentions clear. It was coming for me, and I knew somehow that it wouldn't stop until it had me. I tried to stay awake, tried to keep my eyes open, but exhaustion eventually took its toll. Every time I closed my eyes, I would see it. Those black, soulless eyes staring into mine as if it was peering into the depths of my soul. The nightmares returned with a vengeance, more vivid and terrifying than ever before. I would wake up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, my heart racing, convinced that it was in the room with me. But when I opened my eyes, I was always alone. I knew I couldn't go on like this, but I didn't know what else to do. I couldn't talk to my parents, they wouldn't believe me, and I couldn't go to the police. What would I tell them? That I was being stalked by some kind of monster? No, I was on my own. I spent hours online, searching for any information I could find about the figure, about the woods near my house, but there was nothing. No records, no reports, nothing that matched what I had seen. It was as if it didn't exist, as if it was something out of a nightmare that had somehow crossed over into the real world. And then one night, as I was scrolling through yet another forum dedicated to urban legends and paranormal sightings, I found something. It was a post, buried deep in a thread about haunted forests, and it described an encounter that was eerily similar to mine. A pale, tall figure with black eyes that seemed to watch from the shadows. The post was old, from several years ago, and there were no replies, no follow-up. But the person who had written it had described the same sense of being watched, the same nightmares, the same growing obsession with the woods. And then, at the end of the post, there was a single sentence that sent a chill down my spine. It's watching you because it wants you to come back. I stared at the screen, my heart pounding in my chest. Come back? To the woods? I closed my eyes, trying to think, to piece together the fragments of information I had gathered. The figure had appeared to me that night when I had entered the forest. It had followed me home, haunted my dreams, but it hadn't harmed me, not yet. But what if it wasn't just a random encounter? What if I had somehow awakened it? What if it wanted something from me? The thought terrified me, but it also gave me a strange sense of clarity. If the figure wanted me to come back to the woods, then maybe that was the key. Maybe if I went back I could confront it, find out what it wanted, and put an end to this nightmare once and for all. It was a reckless idea, but I was out of options. I couldn't keep living in fear, couldn't keep running from something I didn't understand. I had to face it. I waited until the next night when my parents were asleep, and then I slipped out of the house. The air was cool, the sky clear, the stars shining brightly above. The forest loomed ahead of me, dark and foreboding, but I didn't hesitate. I had to see this through. The forest was just as I remembered it, cold and silent, the trees casting long shadows on the ground. I walked slowly, my eyes scanning the darkness, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't know what I was looking for, but I knew that it would find me. And then, as I reached the spot where I had first seen the figure, I felt it. The same shift in the air, the same feeling of being watched. I stopped, my breath catching in my throat, and slowly turned. There it was, standing just a few feet away, its black eyes locked on mine. For a moment, neither of us moved. The world seemed to hold its breath, waiting, and then it spoke. Its voice was soft, almost a whisper, but it echoed through the trees like a thunderclap. "You came back." I swallowed hard, my mouth dry. "What do you want?" The figure tilted its head as if considering the question. "You." My heart skipped a beat. "Why? What are you?" The figure didn't answer right away. It just stared at me with those cold, empty eyes, its face unreadable. And then finally it spoke again. "I am the Watcher. I am the keeper of this place, the guardian of the boundary between worlds. And you have crossed that boundary." I shook my head, not understanding. "What do you mean? I didn't do anything." The Watcher's expression didn't change, but there was a hint of something in its voice, sadness maybe, or regret. "You entered the woods, you saw me, and now you belong to me." A cold chill ran down my spine. No, that's not true. I didn't." The Watcher stepped closer, its movements slow, deliberate. "You have awakened something ancient, something that cannot be put back to sleep. You are bound to this place, to me, and you cannot escape." I backed away, my heart pounding in my chest. "I don't understand. Please just let me go. I didn't mean to." But the Watcher shook its head. "It is too late. You are mine now. You will always be mine." Terror seized me and I turned to run, but the Watcher was suddenly in front of me, blocking my path. Its eyes bored into mine, and I felt a cold, icy grip on my soul, pulling me down into the darkness. "No!" I screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the trees, by the night, by the Watcher's relentless gaze. And then, everything went black. I don't know how long I was out, but when I woke up, I was lying on the forest floor, the cold earth pressing against my back. The sky above was still dark, the stars hidden behind a thick layer of clouds. The air was heavy, oppressive, and the silence was deafening. For a moment, I couldn't remember where I was or what had happened. My mind was a fog of confusion and fear, my body aching from the fall. But then, slowly, the memories began to come back. The forest, the Watcher, its black eyes staring into mine. I sat up, my head spinning, and looked around. The trees loomed above me, tall and menacing, their branches swaying gently in the breeze. But there was no sign of the Watcher. Had it really been real, or had it all been some kind of nightmare? I struggled to my feet, my legs shaking, and took a deep breath. I had to get out of here, had to get back to my house, to my parents, to safety. But as I turned to leave, I felt it, a presence just behind me. I froze, my heart skipping a beat, and slowly turned around. The Watcher was there, standing just a few feet away, its eyes locked on mine. But this time there was no malice in its gaze, no threat. It just stared at me, its expression unreadable, its body still and silent. For a long moment neither of us moved. The world around us seemed to hold its breath, waiting. And then, finally, the Watcher spoke. "You are free to go." I blinked, not understanding. "What?" The Watcher tilted its head slightly, its black eyes reflecting the faint light of the stars. "I have seen into your soul. You are not like the others who have come before you. You have faced your fear, confronted the darkness, and in doing so you have broken the bond that tied you to this place." I stared at it, my mind struggling to comprehend what it was saying. "So, I'm free?" The Watcher nodded, a slow, deliberate movement. "Yes, but know this. Though you may leave this place, it will always be a part of you. The darkness you have seen, the fear you have faced, it will never fully leave you." I swallowed hard, my throat dry. What happens now?" The Watcher's gaze didn't waver. "You will go back to your life, but you will carry the memory of this place with you always, and should you ever return, I will be waiting." A cold shiver ran down my spine, but I nodded, too afraid to argue, too relieved to question it. And then, without another word, the watcher turned and disappeared into the shadows, its pale form melting into the darkness of the forest. I stood there for a long moment, my heart pounding in my chest, trying to process what had just happened. And then, slowly, I turned and began to walk, my footsteps echoing in the silence. When I finally emerged from the woods, the first light of dawn was just beginning to break over the horizon. The world felt strange, distant, as if I was seeing it through a fog, but I was alive, I was free, and I knew, deep down, that I would never be the same. In the weeks that followed, life slowly returned to normal, or at least as normal as it could be, after what I had been through. The nightmares eventually faded, and the sense of being watched began to dissipate. But the memory of the watcher, of those black, soulless eyes, never left me. I avoided the woods from then on, never going near the tree line, never daring to enter the forest again. The fear was still there, buried deep inside me, but I had learned to live with it, to accept it as a part of who I was. Sometimes, late at night, I would find myself staring out the window, my eyes drawn to the dark line of trees in the distance. I would wonder if the watcher was still there, waiting, watching, biding its time, but I never saw it again, and in time I came to realize that the watcher had been right. Though I had left the woods, a part of me would always remain there, lost in the darkness, bound to that place by fear and memory. But I was alive. I had faced the darkness and survived, and that was enough. Years later, after I had moved away from my childhood home, I received a letter in the mail. It was from an old friend, someone I hadn't spoken to in years, someone who still lived in that small town near the woods. The letter was brief, but it sent a chill down my spine. I saw it. The watcher. It's still there, waiting. I don't know what to do. Please, help me. I stared at the words, my heart pounding in my chest, my mind racing with fear and uncertainty. I had thought I was free, that I had escaped the darkness. But now it seemed the past was coming back to haunt me. And I knew deep down that I couldn't ignore it. I couldn't run from it. I had to go back. As I packed my bags and prepared to return to the town I had once called home, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning, that the watcher had more in store for me, that the darkness I had faced was only a taste of what was to come. But whatever awaited me in those woods, I knew I had to face it. I had to confront the fear, the darkness, the watcher once and for all, because some things, no matter how deeply they are buried, can never be truly forgotten. And the watcher in the woods was one of them. Thank you so much for watching. Please consider subscribing.